Uber is a company that didn't even exist 10 years ago, but now has a revenue of $7.5 billion and is worth something like 60. Convenient, job-creating, and more than willing, it seems, to not only break the rules, but just entirely ignore them. If you want to know how to create a multi-billion-dollar company in 8 years, Uber's response might be, any way you can. This isn't a video complaining about bad customer experiences. It isn't an attack on Uber drivers, and it isn't going after the service Uber offers. It isn't a video made to complain about that time I got into an Uber driven by a woman who was getting her directions translated by the 7-year-old in the passenger seat. That sort of thing happens everywhere. Instead, here I'm going to look at some of the ways Uber has disregarded rules and regulations, tried to undermine competitors, resisted changes that would benefit drivers or make customers safer, and even conducted extensive subterfuge to deliberately avoid law enforcement and regulatory operations. I'll talk about Greybull shortly. Uber was founded as UberCab in March of 2009 by Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp. It went live in July of the following year. Since then, Uber's primary service is that of a traditional taxi, but one you can order from an application on a mobile device. Journey prices vary depending on demand, and usually waiting for an Uber takes only a matter of minutes. That's how Uber became so successful in the beginning. It is often more convenient than hailing a cab, but it seems its meteoric rise was facilitated by Uber not being subject to the same regulation as traditional taxis in many places. In France, for example, Uber has tried to sell itself as a ride-sharing service, not a taxi service. To the European Court of Justice, Uber has tried to argue that it is an information society service, not a transport service. Regulators are now only just catching up. As early as May 2011, San Francisco, the birthplace of denim jeans, skid mark laws, and Uber, was threatening Uber High Command with 90 days of jail time for every ride the company offered. UberCab, as it was then, faced with a difficult decision for a young startup, took the high ground and changed its name just to Uber. Uber had been presented with a cease and desist, with one bone of contention that would later occur well beyond San Francisco, being insurance. In San Francisco, the law says taxis must carry commercial liability insurance to the tune of $1 million at all times. Uber's coverage, at least up until 2014, was $100,000 per ride per accident and $50,000 between rides. In 2014, district attorneys from San Francisco and Los Angeles filed a consumer protection lawsuit against Uber, accusing the company of misleading customers about its safety practices. The San Francisco district attorney, George Gascon, called Uber's background checks, fulfilled by a private company, completely worthless, because they weren't doing fingerprint checks. I use these two examples because they both feature the birthplace of the company, and they both feature issues replicated world over. It's not a definitive list, but here are a few. The company has fought efforts in Chicago, Arizona, California, and elsewhere to make Uber submit to the same background check and drug testing rules that conventional taxis are required to follow. Portland, in Oregon, sued Uber for breaking city rules, with the mayor calling Uber's actions there illegal, and the Commissioner of Transportation calling Uber a bunch of thugs. In Romania, Uber continues to fight in court to operate despite a ban on taxis operated by unauthorized drivers. In Germany, Uber has battled in the court since early 2014, with a nationwide ban on services using Uber and Uber Pop applications because drivers were operating without authorization, without the right licenses, and Uber didn't have the correct insurance. As in other places, at other times, attorneys representing Uber denied it was subject to rules governing taxi operators, claiming that the company merely acts as an exchange connecting drivers with clients. In response, one of the German judges of a 3-judge panel said, "In that case, you should include in your business description that Uber offers rides for free." That German sense of humour. Uber has been banned in India for safety concerns and after breaking numerous rules. It was suspended in the Philippines after Uber continued to accredit drivers when told not to. It was sent a cease and desist in Taiwan for operating outside of the law, and there is much, much more. The point is, Uber's persistent argument that it merely connects drivers to passengers is not being swallowed by a lot of people. It is generally seen, not everywhere, but in lots of places, as a taxi service pretending to have nothing to do with the drivers or the cars, and it has the resources to stretch out legal challenges and circumvent rules. In the beginning of 2011, Uber announced it had raised $11 million through a series of investments, and it began to expand. India, Mexico, South Africa, the UK, Taiwan, all by 2014. It announced it had raised $258 million in a round of investments in 2013, $1.2 billion in mid-2014, and another $1.2 billion 6 months later. And then soon after, $1.6 billion in debt financing from everyone's favourite sea creature, Goldman Sachs. Less than a month after that, Uber raised another $1 billion. Because of its investments, because it is incredibly well lubricated, and because at one point it was very trendy, Uber seemingly thinks it can kind of do what it wants. Its modus operandi is to enter a city and start service, and dig in when the city regulators come calling. That seems to be the way Kalanick, at least, wants it. An apparent fan of Ayn Rand, he's compared the history of Uber to the plot behind Atlas Shrugged. Did Rapture teach you nothing, Big Daddy? Those who often bear the brunt of anti-Uber feeling are the drivers. Uber's model depends on being cheap, and guess whose paycheck accommodates that? In the UK, the average pay before costs is reportedly about £16 an hour. In the US, it varies between cities, but can be as low as $8 an hour after costs. Uber, as mentioned, tries to resist counting Uber drivers as employees, but independent contractors. In September of 2015, Uber ceased operations in Anchorage because of this. Alaska argued that Uber was misclassifying drivers as contractors instead of employees, which is illegal in that state. In 2016, British courts decided Uber was employing people, not simply contracting them, as drivers were working full-time hours. This has happened elsewhere too, as well as actions from and on behalf of drivers about misrepresentation of the wage they could expect to make. By keeping drivers as contractors, which Uber has managed to do in most places it operates in, Uber doesn't have to pay for benefits. The service can offer flexible hours for those with busy schedules, but by setting the barrier to entry very low, I'd argue their setup is more about getting a high volume of drivers that Uber can dispose of pretty quickly. Uber penalises drivers for some conditions, such as rejecting pickups. But more importantly than that, Uber is seemingly charging towards self-driving vehicles. Come to work for us, we're racing to build technology and pass legislation that will make you obsolete. Uber has been pushing forward with autonomous vehicles, but it has been derailed most recently by a self-driving car killing a cyclist. That led Uber to suspend testing on public roads and indicate that it doesn't plan on further testing in the very near future. Before that, however, in February of 2018, Uber was forced to pay a subsidiary of Google, Waymo, $244 million because an employee of Waymo allegedly stole almost 10 gigabytes of blueprints and other data, then resigned from Waymo to found Otto, and then immediately sold Otto to Uber. You might think that with being mired in more legal problems than some small nation states, Uber would be pretty busy, but not busy enough not to concern itself with opposition research, something it didn't necessarily do, but was floated by an executive.
Legitimate business purposes included going through my garbage and having me followed. So I don't have a lot of confidence in what Uber considers a legitimate business purpose.
Let me push back just a little bit. Did they actually go through with the plan to go through your garbage and follow your kids, or was it just merely suggested at the dinner?
Look, as far as I know, they haven't, but I don't know.
Uber may not have dug up any dirt about journalists and their families, but they did, however, break Apple's terms of service by tagging phones. But again, that's nothing compared to its use of Greyball. Greyball is a tool developed by Uber that can show specified users what is essentially a dud or dummy clone of the Uber app. Uber has admitted to using Greyball to deny services to users, namely regulators and law enforcement. Yes, Uber has admitted to identifying regulators and deliberately not connecting them with an Uber driver, not out of spite, but because they were operating whilst banned and wanted to avoid Johnny Law. That sounds like a legitimate business. This is why Uber is under a United States federal investigation for doing this exact thing in Portland, Oregon, and in Philadelphia. It's one of the main reasons, as well as frustration at Uber's reporting of crimes and approach to background checks, that Uber is currently appealing a ban in London. Uber has said that it will no longer use Greyball to evade law enforcement, and has said its use is to stop violators of Uber's terms and competitors from wasting Uber's time, which is fair enough, but just a little bit ironic considering Uber was forced to apologise in 2014 for ordering and cancelling dozens of rides from newly established rival Get. Lyft, too, have accused Uber of the same, with thousands of rides requested and cancelled, seemingly by Uber employees, in less than a year, from 2013 to 2014. Doing the research for this video, honestly, it's like finding a treasure trove of because there's more. Recent revelations from Bloomberg show that at least 24 times, Uber has used a panic button in its headquarters to remotely lock out computers elsewhere, such as in foreign offices, and change those computers' passwords when visited by authorities, in what a Canadian judge said had all the characteristics of an attempt to obstruct justice. There's no doubt even more, but I'm just about ready to wrap this up. But I know what you're thinking. Where's the hollowed out volcano? I think it's very hard for a business to position themselves as a service for the people when many of their actions make them look, maybe not an enemy of the people, but an enemy of the representatives of the people. Maybe Uber would argue it's an enemy of overregulation, but I think less and less people are seeing it that way. Uber leadership, or the old leadership anyway, may have spoken about regulation and of being a disruptor, but there are very clear differences between disrupting an industry and operating on the peripheries of the law. I know there are going to be business analysts out there who vehemently disagree with me for good reasons, but in my opinion, in the long term, Uber is finished. While they may have substantial assets, their self-driving project is at least severely delayed, so they risk being overtaken by software companies that might be a bit more interested in partnering with Uber competitors. What's more, there are many different sources, including internal sources, saying a fare increase is inevitable and coming soon. Other voices saying Uber was behind in the self-driving race anyway, and the company's culture is so regressive it made Jeff Jones, who was brought in to clean it up, wash his hands of the whole thing. Kalanick has since been forced out as CEO by investors, and the speed in which executives come and go at Uber makes it look like K Street. But more than that, if I had to guess, I'd say Uber's legal troubles, even with the hundreds of lawsuits it's already involved in, are only just beginning. Take all this with the fact that Uber has expended a lot of goodwill, to the point where it's not just members of transportation committees that don't look upon it favourably, but increasingly members of the public, and I'm not sure where Uber can go. But it can drive itself.